Heed the call of heritage. Scrape back the thin veneer of modernity. Grasp and raise again that which has lain so long in dust. From the tales you tell and the songs you sing, to the very food that feeds you. Join us now in finding folklore. Once upon a time, there lived a king. Now this king that there lived was a fine and a powerful king, a conquering king. He was a king with many sons, many lands, much money, and much to be glad of. But this king was also another kind of king. For this king was cursed. Now, a curse is a curse is a curse, I hear you say, and so too thought that cursed king when first he heard talk of it. A curse indeed, he cried, and he laughed himself on until bedtime, and he laughed himself on until breakfast, and he laughed himself straight through to lunch. But still round court there were whispers, and a king who cares not for whispers is a foolish king indeed. So it was, when one whisper too many had slipped into his ear from too many sources, that the cursed king called forth his 3 jesters and demanded to know what this damned business of curses was all about. So the first jester told him, "It's that new forest of yours, your supreme wonderfulness, the one what the natives call the Ettingwood." And the king replied, "What? They've made it a beauty, that forest, the finest hunting ground this damp country's ever seen." And so the second jester told him, "That as may be, your mighty gloriousness, but those ungrateful savages bemoan and beweep at the homes and the farmsteads and the holy grounds that were lost in the process." And the king replied, "Piffle! I barely touched the place, just tweaked it a little." And so the third jester interjected, "That's as may be, your conquering magnificentness, but they're a proud people, these foresters, for they were once an ancient kingdom of their own, and the common folk there hold to old, bold, strange ways, and like the ways of this land that surrounds them." And the king replied, "What on earth are you talking about? Communing with nature, and unwieldy ways of farming. Rustic superstition and provincial festivities, heathen gods and pagan trickery. Well, good for them, but what has any of that got to do with me?" And the fools then spoke as one, an otherworldly glint in all their eyes, an otherworldly voice in all their chests. "And for your trespass in Su Eaton, the Ettingwood, you shall live to see the shrinking of your line, and this new forest floor shall drink your blood, and this new forest wood shall wither your tree, and a low commoner of this new forest shall find the King of England's corpse abandoned to the Ettingwood, and shall drag it from the Su Eaton, and anarchy shall come when your house does fall. Thus spake the common folk, the Etin folk, the foresters." Now this unsettled the king, so it did, as it would unsettle you or me or any man but the rarest or the densest, and for a good few days it was all the king could do to find peace from his fears. But people are a predictable sort, and as day followed day, and week followed week, and month followed month, and all alike and without incident, so the fear began to fade, and fashions began to shift, and whispers whispered on to other things, and soon enough this talk of curses and of forests and of vengeance was all but forgotten. The king no longer flinched to think of the forest. And that was his undoing. For indeed, before long the king was back to hunting and to revelling in this new forest of his, entertaining guests and thrilling family alike with not a second thought for curses, and not a third or a fourth neither. Not until it happened. The king's second son, that day, was riding merrily on through the forest, hunting and hallooing and hollering, and generally enjoying himself as king's sons do on such days, until so overtaken with such merriment was he that his horse bolted on and away from his party, on, away and away, and though all rode hard, none could keep up, and the prince disappeared gone into the thickness of the trees. Some say that the forest itself breathed a cloud of infected air to poison him. Others that when he was found dangling horseless in air, a branch about his lifeless neck, his skull skewered and broken, the steady drip of his blood feeding the roots of the tree that held him, drunk up as it was by that new forest's floor. The court was aflutter. The crowd was aflutter. The king was aflutter. Whispers whispered, gossips gossiped, and old wives told tales of curses. All was hullabaloo until it wasn't. For the loss of a son is the loss of a son, and it struck hard at the king indeed. But these things do happen. Accidents do occur. Hunting is a dangerous game. Could have happened to anyone. And he was the second son, after all. There are others. No need to jump to conclusions, no need to be silly about it. Worse things happen at sea, after all. He was only the second son. But try as he might to put it behind him, and put it behind him as indeed he did, all was not well. I have said that the king had other sons, and this was true. He still had a first, the eldest, a third, the wildest, and a fourth, the weakest. There were various daughters, of course, but he could hardly be expected to keep track of them. Though the eldest was by no means wilder than the wildest, still he was wild. And his was a wildness that fought with his fathers, and fought with his brothers, which is a wilder wildness even than his, and much discord there was between them. And when hate dwells in a family, it weighs heavy on a father. And as his sons bickered and backbit and fought between themselves, so, day by day, month by month, year by year, the king's spirit started to fade. His hopes began to wilt, and his will to live took to decay. When his death came, it was not a heroic one, and was far from the new land he had won, and farther still from the new and beautiful forest he had loved enough to lose a son for. Eaten up by illness and by injury, as that conquering king finally died, he thought of curses, and he smiled a smile within himself that his had not held true. For far from that new forest was the King of England now, and far from any common man, and long in sons he still remained, despite their enmities. But as is so often the way with thoughts, just as that king's lights dimmed and his glory began to depart, he felt this one to stale and to twist, and what should by rights have been a thought of joy, of triumph, and of ease, soured to a scratch, an anxiety. And as he died, he did so afraid, and unsure why. A sorry way to leave this middle earth. The eldest son thereafter took the old land, and the wildest took the new, and neither mourned the old dead king. The weakest was given plenty of gold but no actual power, and this gnawed at him as well it might, and sharpened things in him which no man needs sharpening. Years went by, and as the memory of the old king drifted into the mist of day-to-day doings, so too did memory of the curse, and why not? The king was dead, and long live the king, and good riddance to bad curses and superstitious whispers. In time, the battling brothers, kings now of two different kingdoms, thought to begin the beginnings of the start of reconciliation. So it was. The eldest son sent a son of his own to visit the wildest, who now was known by his people as the Red King. And much joy was there in this new kingdom. And the Red King was a proud king, and a strident king, and a king keen to show his value and his finery at its best, to impress this nephew he had not known he had. And so it was he took him hunting, and he took him revelling, he entertained him, and he hosted him, and he thrilled him, and he did so in his most beautiful of lands. His verdant, fine, otherworldly, new forest. And oh dear, we know what comes next, don't we? For though kings and fools may forget about curses, curses don't forget about them. And into the trees that nephew rode, and when they found him, he was dead. The land was agog. The court was agog. The living and the dead and the ghosts in between were agog. Whispers whispered so loud you could barely hear them. Gossips gossiped till their throats were sore, and every wall was black with writing. Talk of the curse returned, and of the vengeance of the common folk, and the drying of the conqueror's line. The Red King ignored them all. For he was a stubborn king, was this new Red King. Known as Rufus by his friends, who were few, for Rufus means red, and named so he was for the redness of his head, and the redness of his temperament, and the redness of his beard. Short and stout and pot-bellied he was, but prodigious strong too. His rages were infamous, and he would bellow until his fair hair turned the colour of flame, and he would bellow until his eyes turned different shades, and he would bellow till he gave even himself a headache, and nothing made him bellow as loud as all this talk of curses. But bellow as he might, the whispers would not stop. And soon enough, every corner of his castle seemed to hold a warning, every old wife in his kingdom a cautionary tale. A month went by, and another. Still the whispers whispered. Still the talk of the curse was driving him wilder than wildness itself. So King Rufus the Red thought he'd put it to bed, once and for all. And that Red King announced that, on the 3rd month after the death of his nephew, come Lammas, to demonstrate and to evidence and to prove that this was a king who cared not a fig for curses and not a date nor an apricot neither. He would go hunting himself in that there forest new, and not a whisper nor a gossip nor a jester nor a curse could stop him. So how about that? Of course, the whispers whispered with twice the intensity and 4 times the feeling, but Rufus gritted his teeth through them all, for he knew he wouldn't have to put up with it for long. Now he'd shut those whispers up for good. Days passed and weeks passed, and on the 3rd month since the death of his nephew came Lammastide, and with it the month of August and the first fruits of harvest. A fine time indeed to travel, as he did, down to that new forest of his, no longer quite so new as when the curse was first cursed, but new nevertheless as these things go. The king and his retinue, his servants and his servers, his followers and his favourites, his helpers out and hangers-on, all feasted that night in fine style, as Rufus made a fine show of his fine feelings of ease and security in finally going up against the curse. Drinks were drunk, food was fed, and full bellies were potted, and when the Red King went to bed that night, he did so light as a feather and full as a fool, falling nigh on before he reached the room to a deep and dreamful sleep, and whispering to himself as he did so, "Tomorrow we shall hunt." And when the king opened his eyes, he was not in his bed, nor was he alone. Above him was bent a hooded figure, with flaming eye and countenance grim. The king tried to open his mouth to bluster, but found that he could not. The king tried to sit up, to rage, but found that he could not. The king tried to raise an arm to protect himself, as the figure raised an angled blade, but the king found that he could not. As Rufus lay there, helpless, the hooded man bled him like a doctor bleeds a patient, carving deep into his arms to let the liquid flow. And flow it did. For once the flow was steady from his limbs, the pace picked up. Like a tap turned to full, and the flow became a stream, and the stream became a spray, became a torrent, gushing forth, spitting out, arcing like a fountain, filling the sky, till all was red, and red was all, and blood was blood was blood. The king woke screaming from his blood-red dream, and in flooded his guards, and in flooded his servants, and in flooded his friends who were few. Wet with sweat and shaking like a newborn, the king demanded they stay by his side until daybreak, and who were they to disobey? So all remained in silence then, huddled there around the trembling king, torchlight doing the work of the sun till the real thing rose. And when it did, the king, whose nerves had settled to some degree, took a deep breath, pulled himself together, looked to his guards, and looked to his servants, and looked to his too few friends, nodded and said, bold and bright, "Today we shall hunt." And then a knock came at the door. For it seems that a wise monk from far-off lands had been staying back at court that night, and that he likewise had dreamed a dream that sent whispers flowing, and a dream it was that he felt the king should hear, and a rider he dispatched straightway, and that rider rode and rode hard, and rode on past rivers and on past streams and on to that new forest, and on to the hunting lodge where the king stayed. And there at that hunting lodge he told the gatekeeper, who hurried him through, and when he was through he told the doorkeeper, who hurried him in, and when he was in he told the lodgekeeper, who hurried him up, and bid him to knock at the door of the king's chamber. And once he was up, and once that knock was knocked, and once that knock was answered and the rider invited to share his words, what a tale he had to tell, of strange signs and ominous omens, and whispers that rose and fell like the tide, of a wise monk from far-off lands who dreamed a dream of warning. Now I'll tell you what the rider told them that the monk had told him, for he claimed that in his dream he'd been walking through a forest, verdant and green, beautiful and fair, until he came to the sight of a trickling stream, and not too far, but not too near, he saw a church, of the old-styled wooden kind that the country dwellers still clung to here and there. He saw the Red King from afar, and he saw him near, and he saw him enter. He found himself at the doorway, and he found himself inside. Within the church he watched as the king walked up to the rood, that great crucifix, and he watched as the king roared, and he watched as the king hurled himself at the cross, gripping and climbing, biting at the carven body of the sacrificed Christ, gnawing and scraping its arms and its legs. The monk watched as the wooden rood began to move, and the figure of Christ reared up and kicked the apish king to the floor, threw back its head, and screamed. And the sound of that scream was one that scratched the wise monk's bones. And as it screamed from its mouth there flew red flames, and black smoke billowed, and the eaves of the hall did burn, and all about was fire, and all about was red, and all about was black. The Red King laughed. His courage had, with sleep, restored, and he bellowed out, "He is a monk, and dreams for money like a monk. Give him this and be on your way." And from beside his bed he threw the rider a purse filled with gold. And the rider took it, downcast, and returned to court the way he'd come, a tightness in his gut, and sorrow in his heart. What the king thought he'd bought, I cannot say. Despite the bluster, Rufus didn't set off immediately. Indeed, the king was as amazed as anyone by how many minor tasks and long-delayed chores seemed suddenly to be of the utmost importance. So it was that after a large breakfast and small second breakfast came a hearty, drawn-out lunch, for finally the king had run out of reasons to stay. Now this lunch was a strange one, full of forced jollity and strained joy, and he drank more than he usually drank, and his spirits rose as he emptied his cups. For what was a dream anyway? Nothing. He would defy the dream, he would defy the whispers, he would defy the curse. He would hunt. Lunch concluded and drinks drunk. The king and his men and his friends who were few were saddling up and dressing down and generally readying for departure, full-bellied and drink-withery. But just as they were on the off, there came two riders to the hunting lodge with two very different offerings. The first was a local man and arrowsmith by name of Cobb, and he approached the king with 6 fine arrows crafted that very morning from the very trees of that very forest. Now Cobb was known across that place as a man with skills beyond skill, and there were those that said his craft was beyond craft, and he a master of knowledge long since forgotten. For when he gave to the king his arrows, he said to that king, "Take these, your majesty, as a blessing from the forest and its commoners. As fine as the finest arrows you shall find hereabouts, each is bound to find its mark, and to hit the target of true intent." "Magic arrows!" laughed the king. "Whatever next?" And he kept 4 for his quiver, but chose the finest 2 to give to a close friend who was joining the hunt that day, a man by the name of Tyrrell. "The best arrows to the best marksman," cackled the king as he handed them on. "The sharpest to he who inflicts the deadliest shots." The second rider brought very different news. For this rider had travelled over 100 miles that morning, steady south, to reach the king before he departed to hunt. And when he did so, he handed him a letter from his local abbot, a letter that told of a dream the abbot had had that very night, a letter that held a warning. For in his dream, so the letter said, the abbot had seen a vision of Christ and all the host of heaven, standing around the great white throne, He had seen the Holy Mother appear, robed in light, and watched as she flung herself at the feet of her son, praying to him, begging him by his precious blood and his agony on the cross to take pity on the English, praying to him as judge of all men and avenger of all wickedness to punish the king for the crimes of his father. And the Glory Lord answered her there, "Patience, you must wait. The wicked will soon receive their due. In time, retribution will fall." At this the abbot watched as she departed, and another thing took her place. A great black and hairy figure, with broad shoulders and the curven horns of a ram, whose very voice was pain. And as he had started to speak, the abbot woke, screaming. The king read the letter between swigs of wine from his skin, and as he did so he laughed, spraying the red liquid across all who stood too near. "Does your abbot think that I believe the visions of every snoring monk? Does he take me for an Englishman who puts faith in the dreams of every old wife? Keep your whispers and your curses and your omens and leave me to my new forest." And with that, the king threw the letter aside and spurred his horse on and off and away, deep, deep, deep to the woods. And all of his servants and all of his men and all of his friends to a few rushed to follow. Now these were not the only warning dreams that were dreamt that night. These were just the only ones that reached the king. In the days and the weeks and the decades that followed, as all was pieced together and all embellished, as every good story must be, it seemed as if half the land had dreamt omens that night, and a good many of the lands beyond it too. 100 miles east, 2 girls were born who were joined at the shoulders and joined at the hips, so it was said. And elsewhere blood oozed from the ground and rivers ran red, surefire signs of a curse, whispered the whispers. Wouldn't like to be in his shoes. So they hunted here and they hunted there, and they hunted up and they hunted down, and they hunted in and they hunted out. And before you'd know it, the party was scattered across the forest, and Tyrrell and the Red King alone in a glade. Across the land the whispers rose near to deafening, and set a stag galloping past. The king took a magic arrow from his quiver, pulled back his elbow and let it fly. But the beast took the hit and sped on. Like lightning, the king took another, pulled it back and let it go, and again the stag was hit, but again onward still it ran. The king went to take another, but his bag was empty, not an arrow to be found. "Magic arrows, my eye! Shoot, Tyrrell, shoot!" he bellowed. And Tyrrell took up Cobb's arrow, and Tyrrell pulled back his elbow, and Tyrrell let it fly as the punctured stag ran hard between the trees. And the whispers reached their peak. Now each whisper whispered a different account of what came next, but only 2 men knew for sure, and neither are telling. Some said the arrow glanced off a tree and so changed its course. Others that it hit not the stag but a boar, and instead of sinking in it bounced off. Still others say simply that the magic arrow of New Forest Wood changed its own course, turning itself in air. All agree, however, that when the arrow stopped its flight, the shaft sat deep in the Red King's chest, and he fell from his horse without a sound, not even a whisper. For a second that felt like an hour, silence reigned. The moment passed, and all was panic, and "Oh my God, what have I done?" as Tyrrell leapt from his steed to clutch at the corpse of the king, pawing at the bloodied meat, frantic to find some sign of life, knowing full well that he'd fail. He'd killed a king. He'd killed the king, but it wasn't his fault. But who'd believe him? But do you know what they do to king killers? He couldn't be caught. He mustn't be caught. He won't be caught. What's that? Voices, people? Are they coming? Was I seen? Have to go, have to run, have to flee. And flee he did. He fled so fast that he left his faithful dog behind him. And on he fled till he realized his hands were red still with the blood of a king. And he leapt from his steed and he washed them in a pond. And on he fled till he realized his hooves could be tracked. And he rode to a blacksmith's and had the horse's shoes reversed. And on he fled till he reached the coast and reached a ship. And on he sailed without a by your leave. And never did Tyrrell return to these shores. Now, as we have said before, the Red King had 2 remaining brothers. The eldest, in whose lands Tyrrell hid, and the weakest. And it was this latter that had joined Rufus hunting that day. It was this latter who, elsewhere in the forest, had stopped at an old charcoal burner's hut to mend a broken bowstring. And who should open the door to him but an old and craggy woman who looked as if she belonged in the earth? And what should she say to him but that he soon would be king, and that he should remember her words? It was this latter brother that next found the corpse, and it was this latter brother that next abandoned the corpse, and it was this latter brother that sped on from the corpse, and on to seize the crown, for it was this latter brother that became the king thereafter. When the dead king's servants and the dead king's men and the dead king's friends who were few found the dead king, they each in turn turned tail and made themselves scarce, leaving Rufus to hold court under an open sky. It was some 2 hours later when a charcoal burner named Perkis found the body, heaved it into his cart and took the corpse to the nearest cathedral, though it bled unnaturally all the way there. He was buried alongside the elder brother who'd met a similar end, feeding the floor of the forest. A muted funeral by all accounts, with no mourners bar the monks and little ceremony. It is said the tower where he lay collapsed soon after in shame. To this day, the ghost of Rufus can still be seen at Lammastide, and on the day of his death, the pool where Tyrrell washed his hands turns red once more. The blacksmith who reshoed the horse had to pay a fine to the crown for the next 800 years, and the faithful hound that Tyrrell abandoned that day stalks the forest still, ever seeking its long-dead master. The arrowed stag that escaped the king can likewise still be seen, and remains an omen for the death of kings. That night, and for 3 nights thereafter, sightings were reported as far as Cornwall of a great black and hairy figure, with the curving horns of a ram whose very voice was pain, and who dragged in chains the naked, screaming figure of Rufus. And so it was the weakest took the throne, and from that day refused to set foot in that new forest. He in time had a son and heir who he kept safe and distant, and time came and time went, and the weakest grew fat and happy, and in time all talk of curses was long forgotten, and in time even the whispers had seemed to cease. But curses are cunning things, and whispers whisper long past the point when you can hear them, and a full 20 years had passed before his son and heir was sailing back to England from the lands of the eldest, back aboard a bright white ship, newly made from the finest oak the forest had to offer. They were halfway across the seas when the unthinkable occurred. The ship began to creak, the ship began to rend, and the ship began to scream. The forest wood tore itself apart at the nails, and the roaring, bellowing ship ripped itself to pieces as the cold salt water rushed in, as desperate to claw the vessel down as the vessel was to be taken. All but 2 drowned when the boat sank that day, and neither survivor was the conqueror's heir. So it was that for his trespass in the Su Eaton, the conqueror lived to see the shrinking of his line, though he was long since dead when the forest floor did drink of his blood, and long since dead when a low commoner did find the King of England's corpse, and drag it from the Eatonwood, never to return. Thus spake the common folk, the Eaton folk, the foresters. Though the weakest lived on for 15 years, he had no more legitimate sons, and with his death the conqueror's line withered, and a great anarchy came to the land. The line of Perkis can be found in the forest still, and many of them still burn charcoal.
That was the story of the Red King and the White Ship. We'll be back to talk about the story after the Ballad of William Rufus.
900 years ago, sirs, as I have heard men say, a king rode through this forest, his royal stag to slay. Through briar and brake, the huntsman's horn arose with a cheerful swell. But instead of a royal stag that day, the King of England fell. Men called him William Rufus because of his red beard. A proud and a mighty king was he, and greatly to be feared. But nevertheless he dreamed a dream that he did shape to tell, when instead of a royal stag that day, the King of England fell. He drank down wine and ate up meat, and steadied soon his heart. He scorned to heed such foolish fears, and laughed then at the start. But an arrow shot from a short bow, sirs, the fiercest pride will quell. For instead of a royal stag that day, the King of England fell. There was a gallant gentleman rode at the King's right hand. His name was Walter Tyrrell, best marksman in the land. But had he never drawn a bow, for him 'twould have been as well. For instead of a royal stag that day, the King of England fell. The stag broke from his cover free, the hounds they followed fast. With Walter Tyrrell at his side, the Red King galloped last. When sudden rang a piercing cry through wooded brake and dell, and instead of a royal stag that day, the King of England fell. The king is killed, the huntsman called, and around him gathered they. The hounds licked up the royal blood on the greensward where he lay. And Walter Tyrrell spurred his steed, nor stayed to say farewell. For instead of a royal stag that day, the King of England fell. The cursed king kept open court under his oak trees tall. O'er him spread a carrion wing instead of a sable pole. A raven's hoarse note from the bough did toll his funeral knell. For instead of a royal stag that day, the King of England fell. The crowd all fled, there lay the king, till a charcoal burner passed. To Winchester he bore the corpse, and buried him at last. Now where blood flowed along that way, unnatural flowers dwell. For instead of a royal stag that day, the King of England fell. Some say that they do see him still when Lammas comes each year. Some say he wanders, some say chained, yet doomed and restless here. So in the forest where he was slain, we still his tale do tell. How instead of a royal stag one day, the King of England fell.
That was the Ballad of William Rufus, performed by Tim Laycock with Colin Thompson on violin. And before that, you heard The Red King and the White Ship, story told by Brice Stratford, who's with me now. Hello, Brice.
Hello, James.
I'm James Carney. I'm Brice's...
He's with me now.
I'm his associate, your colleague, we're making this podcast, Finding Folklore.
Welcome, welcome all. Welcome. Would you know yet more, weary traveller?
So we're going to talk a little bit about the song, the story, about the kind of context of this mythology or this folklore of William Rufus for this episode.
For anyone who doesn't know, the general setup for Finding Folklore is that we have a story, a good, proper performance storytelling approach to a folk tale of some description.
I guess that's part of like who we are, as we come from a performance background. We're both actors.
We're both actors. I've been a storyteller of some standing, been about 20 odd years, as well as a folklorist and historian. Check out my books on Amazon or elsewhere. An independent bookstore would be fine too. So we start with a story, a good, proper, no holds barred storytelling story. Then we have a newly commissioned song from a professional or long established folk singer or folk musician.
But these are all they're all old songs.
These are all
pre-existing songs.
Long established traditional folk songs that we are commissioning a new recording of, and potentially doing something even more interesting with. Often we'll be translating new lyrics directly from the Old English, for example.
Lovely.
Got that to look forward to. We didn't do that this time, but we're trying to get more obscure songs as well. Certainly some that maybe don't have easily accessible recordings.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a few in our list coming up that there are no available recordings of these songs.
There are indeed.
You have the song, or even that there are no tunes.
Yeah.
So we've kind of searched for those.
And we're sometimes we're going on location and recording the musicians. Sometimes the musicians are recording themselves, but that changes episode to episode. So we have that, and the song will always be related somehow to the tale, to the story. Then we have this little talky bit where we essentially just have a nice freeform brief chat and introduction to the folk culture and the history behind and around that tradition.
Yeah, a bit of an overview of the tradition that we're talking about, which is approached through story, through song, and through a recipe.
Yes, and then at the end, just as a fun little sort of the jolly end of the news,
the cherry on
top. We throw in just a little historic recipe, a bit of traditional food heritage, which again is somehow related to the tradition that we've been discussing. So we've got different pathways into the same tradition: story, song, history, food.
Sort of essentially trying to make it accessible and something that you, the listener, can interact with. I guess. I
hope we are successful in this. Sometimes also there'll be a particular time of year, a seasonal ceremony. This episode has been sort of based around Lammas, for example. Yep.
Which is the time that we are launching the podcast.
Yes.
So on the 1st of August, we're going to be launching the podcast, and that is Lammas. The day before William Rufus was killed.
Which is actually especially relevant because we are holding our launch event today on the 1st at the New Forest show. So at Lammas, at the New Forest show, the day before Rufus was actually shot.
The New Forest, of course, being where you are from and where I have now come to live.
And I think a very appropriate place really to be beginning this.
It really is, because there's a few stories that we have lined up which are New Forest stories. There's you'll see a few of them coming up later on. Bist and Dragon. Do we have Jernegate in this?
I think yes, we do.
He's one of my favorites.
Jernegate comes
look forward to him
early next year. I think we have Jernegate.
But this one particularly strikes me as like the story of the New Forest.
I go around and I talk quite a lot about New Forest folklore and folk tales, partly to publicise my book. But
not just for fun.
Not just for fun. Well, partly for fun, but mainly it's for money. Because that's what the big bucks
are. That's why we do what we do.
That's how you get rich. Usually these talks are in or around the forest, and whenever I do these talks, I usually begin by asking how many people in the room are from the forest, and there's usually a pretty large proportion. I then ask them how many people know the story of William Rufus. How many of them know who he was, who Walter Tyrrell was, how we died, etc. And everybody always knows. Absolutely everyone in the room.
Everybody.
Literally everybody. I'm not exaggerating for effect. Everyone knows the story of William Rufus in the New Forest. I then point out to them that that's quite weird, that outside of the New Forest, people really don't know who William Rufus was or how he died or anything.
I did not know this story before I read it in your book.
Unless you're unless you're specifically interested in or invested in this period of history, there is no reason anyone would know it.
Yeah.
But in the forest, everyone does. And I then ask them whether any of them can remember how or why they know the story.
Uh-huh.
Whether anyone can remember whether they read it or whether they were taught it or anything.
Yeah.
And nobody can. Nobody from the New Forest can remember how they first came across the story.
Spooky.
Because it's everywhere.
Yeah.
It's always been with them. Nobody was taught it and learned it that way.
Yeah.
Nobody came across it in a text.
Yeah, they don't come. It's not a history lesson.
No, it's just always there. It's everywhere. It's really it's suffused into the landscape. It's in place things, the Rufus stone, it's in the Rufus stirrup, it's in flags, it's in images, it's in folklore and ghost stories. It's everywhere. It's something that everybody here just grows up knowing. Almost through osmosis, they know it. I tell them all this and they always realize that and they feel, oh, that's nice. I have some kind of culture of my own.
Yeah.
And then I point out to them that that's probably been true for over 900 years, ever since it actually happened.
Huh. Well, presumably a short period where it was just like
where everyone
the news.
Yeah. Presumably in 1100 when it happens, everyone knows.
Yeah.
But
then
at no point have people in the New Forest ever stopped knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone did not learn in 1100 because of the newspapers or the TV news. They heard through word of mouth.
Yep.
And everyone ever since 1100 in the New Forest has retained that knowledge through word of mouth.
Through the same route.
Through the exact same route. What we have here is an almost 1,000-year-old oral tradition, which has not died out and which has not been affected by the fact that this has been written about consistently in history books throughout that period.
Mm.
That's incredibly rare. Or maybe it's not. Maybe there's others, because this has not been recognized or noticed before. But it's true. Ask anyone from the New Forest and they will affirm this.
All right, I will.
Good.
As soon as I get a chance, I'll ask people.
This is why I think this is the perfect thing to be beginning our show with. It's almost a foundation myth for the forest. In the story itself, as we did it, a lot of those details are excised, and there's good reason for that.
But I mean, still, even with those sort of historical details taken out,
plenty comes across.
I feel like this is a really good explanation for anyone that doesn't know of what the New Forest is, why it's called the New Forest, even though it's very old. Yeah, I mean,
so for anyone who hadn't twigged or seen through it, this story is based on historical fact, and it's the conquering king at the beginning is William the Conqueror. William Rufus the Red, was his third son and did become the King of England and did die in some kind of hunting accident in the New Forest when he was shot by Walter Tyrrell. All that is the truth, in as much as anything is. So
we've got these historical details, these real kings and their real fates. But then we also have the sort of magical element getting involved. These prophetic dreams. We have magic arrows. We have
all of which are those are all part of the 900-year-old literary version of not literary.
Does that make this
chronicle history?
Yeah, it makes it a chronicle history.
Chronicle history. Yeah, chronicle
That's
history.
what you would call this.
For those who don't know, obviously everyone is from myth and legend. People are familiar with. Generally speaking, myth will deal with the gods, and legend deals with people in a perhaps age of the gods, but still people first and foremost. Mm-hmm. You've also got folklore,
nice definition.
Yeah. Folk tales tend to be much smaller scale than legends, and more about and of the folk. Whereas legends,
but still kind of with a supernatural element, often.
Very often, not exclusively, but often, very often, all this stuff tends to have some degree of enchantment to it. I think. But chronicle history, Geoffrey of Monmouth is the great example. I think.
Sure.
It's this lovely weaving together of historical fact and folklore and myth and legend. So you create this thing which uses historical fact to tell something, usually tells some deeper truth. It's enchanting. It's this lovely vague flurry of fact and fiction, of history and folklore, all of it converging so that it's kind of successfully working as both.
And in that kind of story, you get a bit more character, a bit more like personality.
Yeah, and I think those
the
characters
kings involved, for instance.
The magic and stuff, it helps express a truth that wouldn't necessarily be expressed by the cold facts of what happened. Mm-hmm. And that is maybe a sentimental truth or an emotional truth or a moral truth, which I think has real value. If there's a play by Brian Friel called Making History that engages with this quite well, I think. This is not a new notion. So this really is a form of chronicle history, but it's very much developed this folkloric afterlife. So if anybody wants to read more on this story in particular, I highly recommend the book New Forest Myths and Folklore.
Oh, who's that? Who's that by?
It's really interesting up-and-coming author, Brice Stratford, I believe his name is.
Never heard of him.
Never heard of him. Well, you will, James. So I talk in that at length about this, and the approach I take in telling the story in the book is very, very different to the approach I've taken in this podcast, which in turn is very different to the approach I take when I'm at a storytelling event or storytelling in a school or whatever. In the latter sense, it's wrong to call it improvisational. If anyone's interested in acting technique, they may be familiar with Meisner technique. And in Meisner, the idea is that you find the impulse to deliver and perform the line in the eyes of the person you are delivering the line to.
Yeah, the attention is very much placed on the other person in the scene.
Yes, and you don't come up with a specific, narrow, pre-established way of performing it. You find the performance in the other person in the moment. Every performance is unique to the moment in which it's being performed, and that's exactly how I believe performance storytelling should be, and is for me. And I find the specific versions of the stories that I tell in the audience that I'm telling them to. It's in them, and so it's never told the same way twice, and it's unique to every moment, to every listener.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've seen you perform your storytelling, and that it very much comes across, and it is a lovely organic process that you look at the audience and you kind of from looking at them, you know what it is that needs to be said to advance the story. You kind of find a question in the audience's eyes, and you answer that question. But we then tried to bring this into the booth to record, and we tried a few different things. We tried reading the story from the book, and that wasn't what we were looking for. And we tried this sort of more not improvisational, but you know.
Well, and that didn't work, of course, because there was no audience.
There's no audience.
There were no eyes to look in, and the thing is, you're not the audience because you're not the person this is for. Dead. Not if that. The people who this is for, you, in fact, the person listening, you're not here with me, so I can't just find it in you. And so when I was writing it in the book, the version that's in the book, very, very, very different again, because the written text is there, it's static, it's solid, it's unchanging. Absolutely. And you can constantly refer back to it, so you can fill it with dates and names and details and places. And in fact, if anything, it helps when that's all written down. Yeah. You can constantly refer back to those. In an oral sense, though, when that's just heard, I think that a barrage of names and places and dates, I think it's counterproductive. I think it's discombobulating. Yeah, it doesn't keep you rooted.
You don't want to jump
confusing.
Back and check things.
And you can't. The notion is silly.
Well, certainly you can't in a live show performance.
And whilst you technically can in a recorded one, it's unwieldy.
Yeah,
It'd be
you wouldn't
weird
want to.
Why would you do that?
It's not a nice way to listen.
No, it's really not. That's why in this, I didn't refer to William the Conqueror. I referred to the Conquering King. It's there. We know that. Yeah. The four names that I used were very specifically chosen. There's William Rufus, the Red King, of course, that name.
He's central.
Yeah, he's central. And Walter Tyrrell, the Killer. Both very important names. By not engaging with other names, you're really adding focus to them. The other two names are classics and uniquely from the folk tradition of the story. And it's Perkis, the forest charcoal burner who drags the king to Winchester Cathedral, though I didn't call it Winchester Cathedral in the story, as we've just discussed. And Cobb, of course, Cobb, who crafts the magic arrows.
Love Cobb.
Who doesn't, right? Yeah. He loves the Cobb.
Yeah.
So, interestingly, neither of those... So, Perkis is of quite some historicity, but he's not from the written or historical account. He develops sometime later in the folk tradition of the forest. That
So
thing
there really is a family called Purkis
There
that
really is
still
a family
exists.
called Purkis, yeah, that still exists and is still found. In the 18th century, I found lots of references in, I think, Notes and Queries, the journal, to the fact, to there being this tradition that the wheels were actually retained by the Purkis family, the wheels of the cart that pulled the king, and were retained all the way up until the late 18th century when someone's wife angrily took them out and burnt them because the husband wouldn't clean up the house, not knowing what she had done. And in fact, in the 19th century, someone is writing to Notes and Queries confirming not only is this tradition true, but that it was his grandmother that did it, which is fun.
But is the same thing true of cob? Is there some historicity to that?
No, cob's a totally different one. Cob is far more obscure. So the Purkis Purkis element of the legend is very established in any version of the legend you'll find. The cob one is more obscure. Mm-hmm. So there is an area sort of on the edge of the forest called Coblands, and somewhere along the line, this idea appeared. I think in the 19th century, early mid 19th century, we start seeing this idea that the arrows were magic and were provided by this local arrowsmith named Cobb. He appears in a couple of other New Forest tales as well, which we'll come to in later episodes. The Biston Dragon in particular.
Which is like a long time.
300 years later, that's set. Episode 7 will deal with that one.
He's a nice mythological figure then.
Lovely, yeah. But like uniquely local.
Yeah.
And
or folkloric figure.
Or folkloric, yes. And we actually pondered about why he's in there, because he shouldn't work. Cobb as a character shouldn't work.
And he kind of comes out of nowhere and then vanishes back to nowhere.
So there's the question, so why should I include his name when the character's, like, there's no good, obvious narrative or structural reason that he should be there that we could find.
But I really appreciate him. I really like that
he's
there. He's great. He brings colour.
Well, this is this is very much the beauty of a folk tradition, and especially of a folk tale, be it myth, legend, chronicle, history, whatever, is that, and this is something that is not grasped by so many contemporary writers in this field, is that it's not authorial in the sense we used to. Anyone who is writing this stuff, such as myself, should consider themselves a curator, not an intellectual author, not an author. We don't have this. We should not be engaging with it intellectually and projecting what should and shouldn't work, or trying to appropriate it to any kind of manipulative end or agenda. That's not what this is for. This stuff is written by an infinity of authors, of writers. Everyone who ever tells the story is adding to it. It's impossible for one person could tell the same story to 1,000 people. Yeah. Every one of those 1,000 people would have heard a totally different story. And when every one of those 1,000 people tells that story again, the story will be different and unique to the telling. And every time someone else tells it, certain elements will be emphasized, others will be forgotten. And new weird characters and places will get added constantly. And the only ones that will stick are the ones that will work.
So if it's good, then it survives. If it's not, then it's discarded along the way.
It's survivorship bias. It's the wisdom of crowds. And that's the magic of folk culture. It is non-authorial. It's astonishingly democratized in that sense.
Yeah.
And even when there is an author will come along and establish their version, it will then either that will be forgotten because it doesn't chime with the folk, or it will then get taken and rewilded by folk culture, and people will start building on it and altering it. And Cobb is an example of that. So I left him in, and actually, while having done that, it's occurred to me since that those arrows that Cobb makes, are so important. Originally, up until the introduction of firearms in hunting, it would have been obvious that you would hunt with a bow. Bow hunting would have been the standard way. So hunting in this sense would have been synonymous to the audience with bow hunting.
Oh yeah. Obviously,
there's no question.
If you're going hunting, you're doing it with a bow. Yeah.
As such, the notion of these arrows, these magic arrows, you don't really need to focus on that because it's a given that there are these arrows.
There will be arrows.
The payoff of the arrows being magical will be given.
Yeah.
When around the time that the Cobb element of the story starts being introduced and repeated, it's around the same time that people are less familiar with bow hunting.
Bows.
That bow hunting is not going to be the standard thing that people think of when they think of hunting.
Yeah.
And by adding in Cobb, who's a magic arrowsmith, even though he only appears for a tiny moment and then disappears again, it adds this greater weight and focus and draws attention to the arrows, so that then when the arrow hits and kills the king, there's this extra payoff, and it makes it work better. And I didn't come up with the idea that that's what he serves in terms of a narrative purpose, and then because of that, keep him in. I kept him in, relying on the fact that he was there for a reason, and that just because I couldn't see what the reason was doesn't mean I should obliterate him.
Yeah,
and
he's been around for a while.
Exactly. Yeah. Have faith in the story. Have faith in the folk who built the tale, who grew the tale. And I did. And yeah, it's only after the fact that I realized, oh yes, okay, there you go. He serves that purpose. And there will be other reasons, other purposes, and there will be countless other. Just because you don't know why something is there doesn't mean there's no reason for it to be there. It's is it Chesterton's Gate or Chesterton's Fence?
I don't know about that.
Well,
tell me.
So Chesterton's Fence is it's an idea from G.K. Chesterton, the great Anglo-Catholic author and wit. Highly recommend his works, especially The Man Who Was Thursday. Big fan of The Man Who Was Thursday. Favorite of mine. He has this idea that there are two kinds of reformer. There's the kind who sees a fence in the middle of the road and he says, I cannot imagine what this fence is here for. Let's get rid of it. I can't think of why this was ever put here. There's no obvious reason for this to be here. Get rid of it.
Right.
And that's the bad kind of reformer, the foolish kind. The good kind of reformer is the sort who says, no, you fool. Do not remove the fence until you know why the fence was put there. It's one thing to say, this fence was put there for this reason, and that's no longer relevant, or it can be better fixed, or whatever.
Yeah.
So I'll remove it and do something else. But if you just assume there was never a reason for it to be there, of course there was a reason. Just because you don't know what the reason is doesn't mean that there isn't a reason.
So we're not saying don't take out the fence.
We're not saying don't take out the fence. We're just saying...
You can take out the fence if you want.
You can take out the fence. Just wait until you know why the fence was there in the first place.
Yep.
Once you've realized that, then you can make an informed decision whether maybe you remove the fence completely. Maybe the cows that used to try and get to there no longer exist, so it's no longer an issue. Or maybe the fence can be in a different place and work better. But you can't know that if you don't know why it was there.
Why it was there in the first place.
And that's how I feel about folk culture and about...
Yeah. That makes sense for stuff like cob.
Yeah, stuff like cob, etc.
Oh, but you mentioned this kind of the idea of authorial rewilding. If we look back at that, so the song that we heard, the Ballad of William Rufus, that was written... what kind of era was that?
Yeah, that's a really good, very, very well done, Jim. I think you're right. That's brilliant stuff. Good segue. So the song we just listened to, lovely little song, from the brilliant Tim Laycock and Colin Thompson.
Very pleased to have them on.
Brilliant pair. Oh, very, very, very pleased. That was a pleasure going down to Dorset and recording them. Yeah. Wonderful. So the lyrics for that stem from a poem written by Charles Hamilton Ade in the mid-1800s.
And he was writing...
in Lyndhurst. Yeah, he was living in Lyndhurst. Probably not in this very house.
Could be.
Could have been.
Could have been in this very house that we're in now.
Could have been. Who knows? So he was not from the village. He was not from the forest, but he lived here with his mother. He was a dandy, a confirmed bachelor, a man about town, one of those artistic types. And
terrible people,
awful people. He stayed here until his mother died, and then he took the inheritance, went and spent it in London, having a very jolly time of it. But amongst other things, he published some poetry, and this was one of those poems. At some point, and who knows when, certainly by the 20th century, this poem had accrued a tune and was being sung as a folk song.
So originally he wrote it just as a poem.
Yeah, he had nothing to do with it becoming a song.
And then it's taken by the folk.
Took the song, and actually in the original poem, it's a crossbow bolt that shoots him, not a short bow. I think that references a once popular idea that there was an assassin paid for by the weakest king, by the weakest brother, the youngest, or by the church, or by the two of them in cahoots, and he was sort of in a very silly idea. He was a sort of the man behind the grassy knoll with a crossbow, and so I think that's probably why that was there. That's no longer really very enjoyed. That was always more of a literary idea rather than one which was actually part of the folk tradition. And so I think it's interesting that element gets replaced with the more historically accurate short bow, whereby it actually is. I don't think
you get very far with the the 11th century ballistics report on that one.
Yeah, I mean, also, that's another thing. That's another reason I think that's stupid. Yeah, is that a crossbow bolt looks nothing like an arrow.
They know
There's no question of that, which is why that was always a stupid theory thrown around by people who don't really know anything at all, who don't know anything.
Thrown around by idiots.
Another similar one is in the version as it's sung. It refers to carrion. In the poem, it talks about vultures, and there's obviously no vultures.
There's no vultures here.
There's no vultures here. Then there's a couple of other lines further on as well, which is subtly different. And what I think is lovely about that is that that's this rewilding in action. Through it organically and unintentionally and in an undirected way, without any kind of official authority molding or forming it, people are instinctually fixing this unfolk, this anti-folk element of it, and rewilding it back into the folk
interesting when it comes to that Chesterton's fence thing is that like there are changes that just get made, but no one's really responsible for them. There's no choice being
and
made.
That's the difference between reforming and rewilding. I think is that if you are actively and intentionally and consciously reforming. Then even if you're the good kind of reformer, so far as Chesterton is concerned, you're still intellectually coming in and making a change as an author. Whereas when it's this rewilding, no one is making a change for the sake of it. It's just happening. And there's no one author, there's no one reformer. And it either sinks or swims, it is retained or it is lost based on whether the people, the folk, hold on to it. It's far more...
Yeah, sure.
It's democratized, it's honest, there's an authenticity to it that I just don't think... that you certainly don't get from the more authorial, intellectual approach.
Mm-hmm. So there is one change that you did make to the lyrics of...
yes, there is,
of the Ballad of William Rufus, which is...
Well, the opening line in the original was 800 years ago, sirs, as I have heard men say.
Yeah.
Which is obviously out of date, so why not make it 900 years ago?
Well, we'll see if time accepts your change.
Yes, we will. Well, I mean, it'll only last about 80 odd years. I mean, really, in 30 years, it will be nearer 1,000. So,
wow,
isn't that fun how it goes? Yeah, in 30 years, 1,000 years ago, sirs, as I have heard men say, will be the more correct one. Okay. Not long.
Yeah,
fingers crossed. Touch wood. We'll be there to see it.
We'll put it in season 50 or whatever it is.
Whatever it is. Well, wow, we're doing that's very prolific of us. Yeah, crikey. I think that we see this element of folk culture across the board. This instinctual rewilding, this anti-authorship, this wisdom of crowds. You get it everywhere. What I often talk about with folklore is that many people, they don't really connect folk culture, folklore with the modern day, with their lives. Yeah. They think that folklore is something that was collected in the 19th and maybe late 18th or early 20th centuries.
Not something that's ongoing.
And that stops. Yeah, and then it stops. And that's folklore. That was it. And they forget that things continue. I mean, everybody in England today knows somebody who has seen a ghost. Everybody. That isn't an exaggeration. If you think you don't know anyone who's seen a ghost, then you don't know your friends.
Yeah, you're not asking people enough questions.
I promise you know somebody who has seen a ghost. Hands down. Almost everyone believes in good luck and bad luck. There's many other such cases. It's easy to say that you don't believe in witches or magic, but I wonder how many people would be really happy to invite a coven of witches to dance around them and put a terrible curse on them as they, I don't know, slit the throat of a rooster or some sort.
Yeah. Or even,
very few people would be happy to do that.
Walk under a ladder. But I don't really believe, but you don't tread on the crack.
There's this interesting concept here, and it's used. I think the wonderful Dr. Francis Young has referred to this in discussions of belief in fairies and pixies. For more on that, tune into episode 2. Sprack Jack, very much a fairy tale. He talks about how even though people will quite quite intensely say they do not believe in the fairies, they will still behave as if they do. Mm-hmm. They will behave as if they believe in the fairies, even though they don't. And he talks about this as fairies, and this is true of good luck, of bad luck, of ghosts sometimes, of magic, of all this stuff. They are things that exist in the walls between what we believe and what we do not believe. Mm-hmm. They're lived experiences, not epistemological propositions. Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. How'd you like them apples?
Yeah. And the other thought that I had is that the this sort of diffusing of folklore into the quotidian, that also extends into things like gossip.
Yeah.
Just the stories that we tell among ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, every pub, every proper pub that has regulars and locals has a microculture. It's got stories that are told in there, and if the pub's been going long enough, there are stories that have not been written down that have been going for more than living memory. Stories about people who drank there before anyone else there was born. Certainly that's true of all the pubs I know. Every time a pub closes, then a whole microculture has died. And this is oral culture, oral, intangible cultural heritage.
Yeah.
We have that. And obviously pubs is the obvious example because we're English. Damn it. But this is true of little amateur sports clubs or faith groups or women's institute branches. Royal British Legion. Certainly the military is filled with this stuff. You get this everywhere, this intangible cultural heritage.
Well, actually, so on that note, do you have something for us which will make the intangible tangible in the form of something that we can eat?
Oh, yes. Very good, Jimmy. Yes, I do, as a matter of fact. So I have for you a recipe for something called New Forest Venison, or Venison Rufus. I have it here from a book compiled by Dorothy Baldock. It's one of the... Now, anyone who is a food historian will be familiar with the salmon books of local recipes and know that often they're unreliable. But this has been backed up by... I have found another source, a handwritten recipe book, which contains essentially the same recipe. So this one's kosher.
Okay.
Although it's not kosher, so... 2 pounds of venison, minced, 8 ounces of fat bacon, de-rinded and minced, 1 onion, peeled and finely chopped, 6 ounces of fresh white breadcrumbs, 1 tablespoon of fresh chopped parsley, the grated rind of half a lemon, salt, black pepper, 2 eggs beaten, beef stock and parsley sprigs for garnish. Now, it's making a meatloaf, a venison and bacon meatloaf.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, and I doubt this is why, but it's really cool that this is related to Lammas because
it's a loaf.
Yeah, because it's a loaf. Lammas is loafmas. It's the traditional first day of the harvest, and historically, the first loaf of bread will be made from the crop, and that loaf of bread will be taken to the church and blessed in some ritual or ceremony. Hence, loaf mass, Lammas, which is why it's so interesting that this stuff happens with Rufus, this idea of sacrifice of the sacred king. In this version, now I think this could be made as just a meatloaf, which is a 50-50 mix of bacon and venison, or it could be made as is written here.
Yep.
In a bowl together, mix the venison, bacon, onion, breadcrumbs, parsley, lemon rind, and seasoning. Then stir in the beaten egg. Bind the mixture with a little stock. Flour a clean pudding cloth. Place the mixture on it and form into a thick roll. Roll up firmly and tie the ends. Wrap the roll in kitchen foil to form a parcel. Place it in a saucepan of boiling water and boil for 2 to 2.5 hours, topping up the water if necessary. Serve cut into thick slices, garnished with parsley and accompanied by creamed potatoes, a green vegetable, a rich brown gravy, and cranberry jelly. It serves 4 to 6 people and is traditionally cooked by boiling, but if preferred, the mixture can be cooked in a large, well-greased pudding basin in a saucepan of boiling water for 2.5 to 2 3/4 hours.
I do love to hear boil it for 2.5 hours.
Yeah, essentially, you can make this like a haggis, I think, or you can make this like any kind of boiled or steamed pudding, or you could. I think you could also roast it like a meatloaf, or cook it like one would do a sausage meat stuffing loaf.
Mm-hmm. And do you that when it talks about bacon, what are we talking about? We're not talking about that like the thin sliced bacon that you get in packets in the supermarket. Is that more a sort of thick, chunky bacon?
This is it's minced. This is minced bacon that I'm talking about here. So essentially the bacon is minced to the same consistency as the venison, so that they're all mixed up together. That's the way it's done here.
Would it begin as rashers, or is it?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you like.
What are you going to do when you make it?
Well, I've ordered it ready minced from the butcher up the road, from the New Forest family butcher on Lyndhurst High Street. Very, very, very good butcher. Hooray, hooray, hooray.
Great. Well, we will.
Yeah, we'll be cooking that. I'm cooking that tomorrow, in fact.
Yeah. And then we will share some pictures on our Instagram. I think
we might, if you're lucky and there's enough demand. I might even make a video of cooking it. And perhaps people's reactions. So we've got a fun little video recipe of this venison Rufus.
But we can put the recipe on the.
We can put the recipe up online. Yeah, because I cannot find it on the internet anywhere. So
we'll put it in our show notes and
and if people want it, we'll make a video. We'll make
on our YouTube. So in fact,
video.
that brings us nicely onto the videos, because we're going to be. This has just been a short kind of overview of an
introduction to discussions around and about the heritage of all this stuff. But some people out there, like us, are incredibly dull and want to watch 3 hours nerdy, of dense conversation about the whys and the wherefores of this stuff. So for that wonderful, beautiful crowd, we are going to be releasing a video, I think, on the 7th of August.
It'll be about a week after each episode.
About a week after each episode, approximately a week after each podcast episode is released. We're going to release a long-form 2-3 hour discussion where we just do a real deep dive into everything behind the story, the song, the folk tradition, and our experiences engaging.
Anything we can think of digging into.
Everything and anything.
Just chat for us.
It's going to be very vague and meandering.
But interesting. I think it will be. I think we'll find some really I think we'll find some rich veins of interesting things.
No doubt.
To chat about.
No doubt.
It'll be great. It'll be great.
It will be good fun if we can get the hardware to work.
Yeah.
So that's that. I think maybe now, I hope you all enjoyed the first episode of Finding Folklore. Certainly, we've had a wonderful time, a ridiculous time making it. And I think as a reward for your patience, we will conclude the episode, and I'll read you out.
Take us out on an extract from a poem.
And we'll read you out on an extract from a poem called The Red King by Charles Kingsley. And I think it was published in 1847. The king was drinking in Malwood Hall. There came in a monk before them all. He thrust by squire, he thrust by knight, stood over against the dais aright. And the word of the Lord, thou cruel Red King, the word of the Lord to thee I bring. A grimly sweven I dreamt yestreen, I saw thee lie under Hollin's green, and through thine heart an arrow keen, and out of thy body a smoke did rise, which smirched the sunshine out of the skies. So if thou God's anointed be, I rede thee unto thy soul thou see. For mitre and pall thou hast dissoled, false knight to Christ for gain and gold. And for this thy forest were digged down all, steading and hamlet and churches tall, and Christ's poor were ousten forth, to beg their bread from south to north. So tarry at home, and fast and pray, lest fiends hunt thee in the judgment day.
Finding Folklore with Brice Stratford and James Carney. The Ballad of William Rufus was performed by Tim Laycock and Colin Thompson. The theme music was composed by Su Eaton. Join us next time in Finding Folklore.